Close your eyes now, and let yourself sink deeper into the comfort of your bed. Feel the weight of the day lifting away, dissolving like morning mist under the sun. Your breathing slows, becomes steady, rhythmic like the gentle waves lapping at an ancient shore. Tonight, we journey back through the corridors of time, back to an age when the world was young, and the gods walked among primordial forces that shaped the very fabric of existence. This is a story of cosmic warfare, of fathers and sons, of prophecy and destiny, told in the soothing cadence that will carry you into peaceful slumber. Let the tension in your shoulders release. Let your mind drift on the current of this ancient tale. The Titanomachy, the great war between the Titans and the gods of Olympus, unfolds before you now like a dream painted across the canvas of the night sky. There is nothing you need to do, nowhere you need to be. Simply listen, breathe, and let yourself be carried away to that time before time, when mountains trembled, and the heavens themselves were torn asunder by divine conflict. Not chaos as we understand it today, with its connotations of disorder and confusion, but rather a vast, yawning emptiness, an infinite void that stretched beyond comprehension. From this primordial nothingness emerged the first beings, entities so fundamental to existence that they were not merely gods but the very forces they represented. First came Gaia, the earth herself, broad-breasted and eternal, the foundation upon which all life would eventually flourish. She was not simply a goddess who ruled over the earth but was the living, breathing soil, stone, and mountain ranges that would become the stage for all the dramas of existence. Then came Tartarus, a place and a being simultaneously. The deep abyss far beneath even the roots of the earth. A prison pit so profound that if you dropped a bronze anvil from the heights of heaven, it would take 9 days and 9 nights to reach the surface of the earth, and another 9 days and 9 nights to plummet down to the depths of Tartarus. This was the undermost place, shrouded in eternal darkness, ringed with walls of bronze and gates that no light could penetrate. And there was Eros, the force of attraction and desire. Not the chubby cherub of later imagination, but a primordial power that would draw things together, that would forge connections and create bonds across the nascent cosmos. From Gaia alone came Uranus, the sky, who stretched himself across her like a dome of stars, embracing the earth in an eternal union. Their coupling brought forth children, beings of tremendous power who would be known as the first generation of divine offspring. But these were not the only children born from this sacred marriage. Before the Titans came 3 beings of such monstrous appearance and terrifying strength that their very existence would shape the conflicts to come. The Cyclopes were born first from this union, 3 brothers whose names echoed the forces they commanded. Brontes, whose name meant thunder, Sterapes, called lightning bolt, and Argesh, the bright flash. Each of these giants possessed only a single eye, round and gleaming like an orb, set in the center of their foreheads. These were master smiths, beings who could forge weapons of such power that they could reshape the very cosmos itself. After the Cyclopes came 3 more brothers, even more terrifying in their appearance. The Centimanes, whose name meant the 100-handed ones, were colossal beyond measure. Each possessed 50 heads that could bellow and roar simultaneously, creating a cacophony that could shake mountains. And each possessed 100 arms, rippling with supernatural strength, capable of hurling massive boulders with devastating accuracy. But Uranus, gazing upon these monstrous offspring, felt not pride but fear. Their power was too great, their appearance too terrible. He saw in them a potential threat to his supremacy over the cosmos, and in his paranoia, he made a decision that would echo through eternity. As soon as each of these 6 beings was born, Uranus seized them and thrust them down into the dark depths of Tartarus. The Cyclopes and Centimanes, innocent of any crime save being born powerful, found themselves condemned to an existence of darkness and isolation. Gaia felt each imprisonment as a wound to her own flesh. The pain of it burned within her like molten rock beneath the earth's surface, building pressure, seeking release. But she endured, waiting, for she knew that more children would come. And indeed they did. From the continuing union of Uranus and Gaia came 12 more offspring, beings who would come to be known as the Titans, the elder gods who would rule during what some would later call the Golden Age. There was Oceanus, who would embody the great river that the ancients believed encircled the entire world. Zeus, whose name suggested intelligence and questioning. Cronus, associated with the constellations. Hyperion, a being of light and radiance. Iapetus, who would father some of the most important figures in later myths. And the youngest of the male Titans, Cronus, whose name would become synonymous with time itself, and whose role in the coming drama would be pivotal. The female Titans, called Titanesses, were equally powerful. Thea, who shone with the light of precious metals. Rhea, who would become mother to the Olympian gods. Themis, the embodiment of divine law and order. Mnemosyne, whose name meant memory. Phoebe, bright and radiant like the moon. And Tethys, associated with the primal waters. These 12, unlike their monstrous siblings, were beautiful and terrible in equal measure. They were gods in a form that would become more familiar in later ages. Uranus did not imprison these children, perhaps because they seemed less immediately threatening. But Gaia's rage had not diminished. She took the hardest substance she could create, adamantine, a metal harder than diamond, and from it she fashioned a great sickle, curved and wickedly sharp. Then she called her Titan children to her, and explained what Uranus had done. She asked which of them would be brave enough to use the weapon against their father, to punish him for his cruelty, and free their imprisoned brothers. The Titans were afraid. One by one, they refused or remained silent, until only Cronus, the youngest, stepped forward. Perhaps it was ambition that drove him, or perhaps it was genuine outrage. Gaia hid Cronus, concealing him in a place where he could lie in ambush. When Uranus came to lie with Gaia, stretching himself across her in their eternal coupling, Cronus struck. With a single sweep of the sickle, he castrated his father, severing the generative force of the sky. The blood that fell from this wound splattered across the earth, giving birth to the Furies and the Giants. Where the severed genitals fell into the sea, the foam churned and from it arose Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty, born from the violence that ended one age and began another. Uranus, mutilated and defeated, retreated to the furthest reaches of the sky. As he withdrew, he cursed Cronus, prophesying that just as the son had overthrown the father, so too would Cronus be overthrown by his own offspring. With Uranus deposed, Cronus took his place as the supreme ruler of the cosmos. The other Titans acknowledged him as their king, and for a time, there was a period of relative peace and prosperity. This was the age that later storytellers would look back upon with nostalgia, calling it the Golden Age. But Cronus's reign, for all its outward prosperity, was poisoned from the beginning by the prophecy Uranus had spoken. The words echoed in Cronus's mind, growing louder with each passing age. As he ruled, he could not escape the knowledge that somewhere, somehow, one of his own children would rise against him just as he had risen against Uranus. The thought consumed him, transforming from a mere worry into an obsession that would define his rule and lead to his ultimate downfall. Among the Titanesses, there was Rhea, daughter of Uranus and Gaia, sister to Cronus. In the way of the ancient gods, where the sacred marriage between related deities was common and expected, Cronus and Rhea became consorts. Their union should have been a cause for celebration, a joining of two of the most powerful beings in the cosmos. And when Rhea became pregnant with their first child, it should have heralded the beginning of a new generation of gods who would inherit and maintain the order Cronus had established. But Cronus remembered the prophecy. When Rhea gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Hestia, Cronus looked upon the infant with fear rather than love. In his paranoia, he saw not an innocent newborn but a potential threat, a being who might one day become the instrument of his overthrow. And so, driven by terror and the desperate need to circumvent fate, Cronus did the unthinkable. He seized the infant Hestia and swallowed her whole. The child did not die, for gods cannot truly die, but she was trapped within her father's belly, imprisoned in darkness much as the Cyclopes and Centimanes had been imprisoned in Tartarus. Rhea was devastated, her maternal instincts warring with her helplessness in the face of her husband's power and fear. She begged Cronus to reconsider, pleaded with him that surely an infant daughter posed no threat, but he would not listen. The prophecy had spoken of his children, plural, and he would take no chances. When Rhea became pregnant again, she hoped against hope that perhaps Cronus would change his mind, that the horror of what he had done would have awakened some dormant compassion. But when she gave birth to their second daughter, Demeter, the pattern repeated itself. Cronus took the newborn and swallowed her, condemning another of his children to the darkness within him. Rhea's heart broke anew, but she was powerless to stop him. A third pregnancy brought a third daughter, Hera, and once again, Cronus's fear overrode any paternal feeling. Down into the darkness Hera went, joining her sisters in their strange non-death within their father's stomach. With each swallowing, Cronus felt his anxiety ease slightly, convincing himself that he was successfully preventing the prophecy from coming to pass. But the temporary relief never lasted long, and soon the fear would return, gnawing at him like a hungry beast. The fourth child was a son, and Rhea named him Hades. Perhaps she thought that having a male child would make a difference, that Cronus would recognize the boy as a potential ally rather than a threat. But if anything, a son made Cronus even more paranoid. For surely a male offspring was more likely to challenge him as he had challenged Uranus. Hades disappeared into his father's belly just as his sisters had before him. The fifth child, another son named Poseidon, met the same fate. 5 children now dwelt within Cronus, alive but imprisoned, growing to divine adulthood in the strangest of prisons. Rhea's grief had transformed into something harder, colder. Her love for Cronus, already strained by his monstrous acts, began to calcify into resentment, and then into determination. She could not continue to bear children only to have them devoured. Something had to change. When Rhea discovered she was pregnant for the 6th time, she knew she had to act. She went to her mother, Gaia, and her father, Uranus, who despite his mutilation and exile still had knowledge of the cosmos and the future. Together, they devised a plan. Rhea would give birth in secret, far from Cronus's watchful eye, and then she would deceive her husband with a substitution that would save at least this one child from imprisonment. As her time drew near, Rhea traveled to the island of Crete, to a cave on Mount Ida, or in some tellings to Mount Dicte. The location mattered less than the secrecy, the isolation that would keep Cronus from discovering what she was doing. In that hidden cave, surrounded by the primordial forces that protected her, Rhea gave birth to a son, She named him Zeus. A name that would echo through the ages, that would become synonymous with divine power and justice. But Rhea could not stay in Crete with her newborn. Cronus would notice her absence if she delayed too long, would become suspicious of her actions. So she entrusted the infant Zeus to protectors who would raise him in secret. In some versions of the tale, he was nursed by a goat named Amalthea, whose milk gave him divine strength. In others, nymphs called the Meli tended him, feeding him honey and the milk of Amalthea. The Curetes, young warrior spirits, danced around the cave entrance, clashing their shields and spears to create a din that would mask any sounds the baby made, preventing his cries from reaching Cronus's ears. While Zeus grew in secret on Crete, Rhea returned to Cronus with a bundle wrapped in swaddling clothes. Cronus, consumed by his fear and seeing only another child to be eliminated, did not look closely at what his wife presented to him. He snatched the bundle and swallowed it whole, feeling the familiar relief of having neutralized another potential threat. But what he had swallowed was not his son Zeus. Rhea had wrapped a large stone in the swaddling clothes, presenting it as if it were the infant. Cronus, in his haste and paranoia, had swallowed the stone, and Zeus remained safe and hidden, growing stronger with each passing day. On Crete, the young god flourished. He grew not in the slow way of mortals but with the rapid development of the divine. He learned of his heritage, of his father's crimes, of his siblings trapped within Cronus's belly. And as he grew, so too did his determination to fulfill the prophecy his grandfather Uranus had spoken, to overthrow the tyrant who had devoured his brothers and sisters, to free them and claim his rightful place as ruler of the cosmos. The years passed, measured in the slow turning of the seasons and the wheeling of the stars. Zeus became a young god of tremendous power and cunning, blessed with his mother's resilience, and tempered by the knowledge of his father's cruelty. He knew that he could not simply march up to Mount Othrys and demand that Cronus yield. The Titans were too powerful, Cronus too entrenched in his rule. If Zeus was to succeed where so many potential rebellions had failed before they even began, he would need to be clever. He would need allies. And most importantly, he would need to free his siblings from their imprisonment. The transition from hidden child to divine challenger required careful planning. Zeus could not simply appear on Mount Othrys as a fully grown god without raising immediate suspicion. He needed to get close to Cronus, to win a position from which he could execute his plan. And so, through means that the myths leave somewhat vague, Zeus presented himself to his father not as the son Cronus thought he had swallowed, but as a young servant, a cupbearer who would serve the king of the Titans. It is a testament to Cronus's arrogance and the completeness of his self-deception that he did not recognize his own son. Or perhaps the prophecy had made him so paranoid about his children that he could not conceive of one having escaped his vigilance. Whatever the reason, Cronus accepted this new cupbearer into his service, never suspecting that the young god who poured his wine and served his ambrosia was the very instrument of destiny he had tried so hard to prevent. Zeus served his father with apparent loyalty, all the while watching and learning. He observed the other Titans, noting which ones seemed content with Cronus's rule and which harbored their own grievances. He studied the layout of Mount Othrys, its defenses and vulnerabilities, and he waited for the right moment, the perfect opportunity to set his plan in motion. That moment came through the assistance of Metis, an Oceanid, one of the 3,000 daughters of the Titans Oceanus and Tethys. Metis was known for her wisdom and cunning, her name itself meaning counsel or wisdom. She had her own reasons for wanting to see Cronus's rule challenged, perhaps foreseeing the better world that could exist under different leadership, or perhaps simply believing in justice over tyranny. When Zeus revealed his true identity to her and explained his intentions, she agreed to help him. Together, Zeus and Métis concocted a mixture, a powerful emetic that would cause even a titan to lose control of his stomach. In some versions of the tale, this potion was laced with mustard and salt, substances that would create an irresistible urge to vomit. In others, it was a more mystical concoction, a brew made from herbs that existed only in the earliest days of the world, combined with Métis's own divine craft. Zeus mixed this potion into Cronus's wine or his ambrosia, the food of the gods. Cronus, unsuspecting, consumed what his cupbearer offered him. Almost immediately, he felt a terrible churning in his stomach. The sensation grew worse and worse until, unable to control himself, Cronus began to retch. But what came forth was not merely the contents of a divine meal. First came the stone that Rhea had substituted for Zeus. That false infant that Cronus had swallowed thinking it was his youngest child. The stone fell to the ground, and it would later be placed at Delphi as a monument, a reminder of the deception that had saved the king of the gods. But the stone was only the beginning. Cronus continued to heave, and from his mouth came Poseidon, fully grown, blinking in the sudden light after so long in darkness. Then came Hades, emerging with the pallor of one who would eventually make his home in the realm of the dead. Then Hera, regal even in her strange birth. Then Demeter, who would bring the cycles of growth and harvest to the world. And finally, Hestia, the eldest, who had been the first to be swallowed and was now the last to be freed. They had not aged in the conventional sense during their imprisonment, but they had somehow grown to divine adulthood within their father's belly. And they emerged as powerful gods ready to take their place in the cosmos. The 6 children of Cronus stood together for the first time, seeing each other with physical eyes for the first time despite whatever connection they might have maintained during their shared imprisonment. Zeus revealed himself as their brother, the one who had escaped their father's paranoia and had engineered their freedom. And as they looked upon Mount Othrys and the Titans who had allowed this injustice to continue, as they remembered the darkness and the years of captivity, a single thought crystallized in their minds. Cronus could not be allowed to continue his rule. The age of the Titans had to end. But they were 6 against 12, 6 young gods against the established Titans who had ruled for ages uncounted. Cronus had already recovered from his bout of nausea, and the other Titans were rallying to his side. The newly freed gods would have been overwhelmed if Zeus had not already planned for this moment. He had not spent his years in secret merely growing strong. He had been gathering information, understanding the political landscape of the divine realm, and identifying potential allies who might be convinced to join their cause. Zeus knew of the Cyclopes and the Centimanes, still imprisoned in Tartarus where Cronus had left them after taking power from Uranus. These beings, unjustly punished and possessing tremendous power, would be natural allies if they could be freed. But Tartarus was not simply a pit one could descend into casually. It was guarded, protected not just by distance and darkness but by a fearsome creature that Cronus had placed there to ensure his most dangerous prisoners could never escape. Camp was her name, a she-monster of nightmarish aspect. Descriptions of her vary in the ancient sources, but all agree she was terrifying beyond measure. She had the upper body of a beautiful woman, but this was deception, for her lower half was that of a serpent or dragon, and around her waist writhed 50 living snakes, each with its own fanged head. A scorpion's tail curved over her back, dripping venom. She was the jailer of the damned. And she had kept the Cyclopes and Centimanes prisoner for generations. Zeus, still newly come into his full power but blessed with the courage that would define his character throughout the ages, descended into the depths. Down he went, past the realm of Hades where the dead would one day dwell, deeper still into regions where no light had ever shone and no sound had ever echoed except the groans of the imprisoned. There he found camp, coiled around the gates of the deepest prison, her many snake heads hissing in the darkness. The battle between Zeus and Camp is not described in great detail in the surviving sources, but we can imagine the titanic struggle that must have taken place. Zeus, wielding whatever weapons he had managed to acquire before this descent, fought against a monster that had never been defeated. Perhaps he called upon the nascent power of storms that would later become his primary domain, striking Camp with lightning and thunder. However the battle unfolded, Zeus emerged victorious. Camp was slain, her serpentine body collapsing across the very gates she had been set to guard. With the guardian defeated, Zeus broke open the gates of that deepest prison. The Cyclopes and Centaurs, who had been trapped in darkness since Uranus first imprisoned them, who had endured generation after generation of isolation and powerlessness, suddenly found themselves face to face with the young god offering them freedom and vengeance. They needed little convincing to join Zeus's cause. Here was a being who had descended into the deepest darkness to free them, who had slain their jailer and offered them not just liberty but purpose. The Cyclopes and Centaurs emerged from Tartarus for the first time in living memory. The Cyclopes, those mastersmiths with their single gleaming eyes and their unmatched skill at the forge, looked upon Zeus and his siblings and saw not just gods who had freed them but gods who would need equipment for the coming war. And the Cyclopes, grateful beyond measure and eager to prove their worth, set immediately to work. In some hidden forge, perhaps deep within the earth where the fires of creation still burned hot, the Cyclopes labored with all their considerable skill. Brontes brought his mastery of thunder, Steropes his understanding of lightning, and Ardresh his knowledge of the bright flash that illuminates the darkness. Together, they created weapons unlike anything the cosmos had ever seen, arms that would become the very symbols of the gods who would wield them. For Zeus, they forged thunderbolts. Not mere lightning given physical form, but concentrated divine wrath that could be hurled like javelins. These were weapons of pure elemental force, crackling with electricity, rumbling with the sound of thunder, capable of striking with devastating accuracy and power. When Zeus held his first thunderbolt, feeling the energy coursing through it, he knew that the balance of power had shifted. No longer was he merely a young god challenging established authority. He was armed with the very forces of the storm itself. For Poseidon, the Cyclopes crafted a trident, a three-pronged spear that would give him command over the seas and the earth itself. This was no ordinary weapon but a divine instrument that could summon tsunamis, create earthquakes when its point struck the ground, and part the waters at its wielder's command. Poseidon, who would later become lord of all the oceans, held his trident and felt the connection to water and stone that would define his divine nature. For Hades, they created a helm of darkness, also called the helm of invisibility. This was a cap or helmet that, when worn, rendered its bearer completely invisible, not just to mortal eyes but to divine perception as well. The strategic value of such a weapon could not be overstated. An invisible god could slip into enemy camps, sabotage defenses, gather intelligence, and strike without warning. Hades, who would eventually rule over the unseen realm of the dead, received a weapon perfectly suited to his nature. But the gifts of the Cyclopes were not the only boon Zeus received. As word spread through the divine realm that a new power was rising, that the children of Cronus had been freed and had taken up arms against their father, other deities began to make their choices about which side to support. The first to pledge allegiance to Zeus was Styx, a river goddess, daughter of the Titans Oceanus and Tethys. Styx was ancient and powerful, embodying the river that would eventually form the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Her father Oceanus, wisest of the Titans, urged her to side with Zeus, perhaps because he could read the currents of fate better than his brothers and sisters. Styx did not come alone. She brought with her 4 of her children, each an embodiment of powerful forces that would prove invaluable in the coming war. Nike, whose name meant victory, came with her mother. She would become Zeus's charioteer during the war, steering his divine chariot through the chaos of battle, her very presence ensuring triumph. Kratos, embodying power or strength, brought his overwhelming might to Zeus's cause. Bia, representing force, added her own indomitable will. And Zealous, whose name meant zeal or emulation, brought passionate dedication to their new lord, as a reward for being the first to pledge allegiance. Zeus made Styx's name the most powerful oath among the gods. To swear by the river Styx became the most binding of all promises. Other allies came forward. Themis, one of the Titanesses, sided with Zeus despite being of his father's generation. She recognized in Zeus someone who would rule with justice rather than fear, and she brought her wisdom to his cause. With Themis came her son Prometheus, whose name meant forethought. Prometheus was a Titan by birth but possessed the gift of prophecy and incredible foresight. He knew how the war would end before it began, and he made the strategic decision to side with the winners. His brother Epimetheus, whose name meant afterthought, followed Prometheus's lead. Meanwhile, on Mount Athres, Cronus was gathering his own forces. The Titans who sided with him formed an impressive array. Hyperion, the Titan of light, brought his radiance to illuminate their cause. Iapetus, known for his fierceness in battle, rallied to his brother's defense. Zeus and Cryus, the Titans of celestial phenomena, used their knowledge of the heavens to strategize. And perhaps most importantly, Atlas, son of Iapetus, emerged as the battlefield commander of the Titan forces. Atlas was renowned for his strength and endurance, a giant of tremendous power who stood as tall as mountains. He became Cronus's general, the leader who would coordinate the Titan forces during the battles to come. Where Cronus might hesitate or second-guess himself, haunted by the prophecy that was coming true before his eyes, Atlas provided steady leadership and unwavering determination. Beside him fought his brother Menoetius, known for his own fierce nature and violent temper. The Titans also had allies beyond their immediate family. Aegeon, a god of the stormy seas, brought his power over the waters to counter Poseidon's divine authority. The Gorgonites, a monstrous being whose very appearance could inspire paralyzing fear, joined the Titan cause. These and other entities rallied to Cronus, some out of loyalty, some out of fear, and some simply because they could not imagine a world where the established order was overthrown. The lines were drawn. On one side, the Olympians, as Zeus and his siblings would come to be called, named for the mountain they would eventually claim as their own. With them stood the Cyclopes with their divine weapons, the Centimanes with their terrible strength, and various Titan and lesser deities who saw in Zeus the possibility of a better, more just cosmic order. On the other side, the Titans, the old gods who had ruled since the overthrow of Uranus. Led by Cronus, who fought now not just for power but for his very survival. For he knew that defeat would mean imprisonment, or worse. The stage was set for a conflict that would reshape the cosmos. Two mountains in the region of Thessaly in central Greece would become the focal points of this divine warfare. The Olympians claimed Mount Olympus as their stronghold, a peak that rose nearly 3,000 meters above sea level, its summit often shrouded in clouds, majestic and formidable. The Titans remained on Mount Othrys, their traditional seat of power, a mountain range about 130 kilometers to the south, with peaks reaching over 1,700 meters. The landscape of Thessaly would be forever marked by what was about to unfold. This was not a war fought in some abstract divine realm but in the physical world, on real mountains and across actual plains. The ancient Greeks, telling these stories, could point to the mountains where the gods had fought and imagine the titanic forces that had once clashed upon their slopes. Mount Olympus was a massif, a great cluster of peaks rather than a single summit. Its highest point, Myticus, meaning nose, jutted into the sky like a titan's fist thrust toward the heavens. Around it clustered other peaks, some with names that would later carry religious significance. Stephani, also called the throne of Zeus, presented a particularly imposing face of sheer rock. The mountain was scored with deep ravines and gorges, natural fortifications that the Olympians could use to their advantage. Springs flowed from its heights, and in those early days before the war, forests of oak and beech covered its lower slopes. The mountain's isolation was one of its great strengths. It rose dramatically from the plains around it, a natural fortress with limited approaches. The Olympians could see for vast distances from its heights, watching for any movement of Titan forces. And the peak itself, so often wreathed in clouds and mist, seemed to touch the realm of Aether, the clear upper air where the divine properly dwelt. Mount Othrys, by contrast, was more of a mountain range, stretching east to west across the landscape. It formed a natural barrier between the regions of Thessaly and central Greece. The range was rugged and wild, composed largely of ophiolite rocks, remnants of ancient oceanic crust thrust up by tectonic forces eons before. The Titans who based themselves there used its many peaks and valleys to establish defensive positions, creating a network of strongholds that would not be easily overrun. Between these two mountain strongholds lay the plains of Thessaly, a region that in later ages would be known for its fertile fields and horse breeding. But during the Titanomachy, these plains became a no-man's land, a battlefield where divine forces clashed and the earth itself was torn apart by their conflict. Rivers that flowed through the region, tributaries of the Penaios that drained into the Thermaic Gulf, would run with divine ichor, the golden blood of the immortals. The distance between Olympus and Othrys meant that direct assaults on each other's strongholds required traversing dangerous territory. Armies had to cross the intervening plains, exposing themselves to attack. Supplies, if gods needed such things, had to be transported along vulnerable routes. Intelligence gathering became crucial, with both sides sending scouts and spies to monitor enemy movements. This was the geography that would frame the Titanomachy. Two divine fortresses separated by contested ground, each side seeking to maintain their position while probing for weaknesses in the enemy's defenses. The war would not be decided by a single battle but by a long campaign of attrition, strategic maneuvers, and ultimately, by which side could maintain their will to fight as the conflict stretched from years into decades. The war, when it finally erupted in earnest, was unlike anything the cosmos had ever witnessed. This was not a conflict between mortals, where individual human lives might be snuffed out and armies could be routed in a day. This was divine warfare, where the combatants could not truly die, where each god possessed power enough to reshape mountains and boil seas. The Titanomachy would not be measured in days or months but in years. An entire decade of continuous conflict that would test the endurance and determination of both sides. In the beginning, the battles were tentative, each side feeling out the other's strengths and tactics. The Olympians would descend from Mount Olympus, Zeus at their head wielding his thunderbolts, Poseidon with his earth-shaking trident, Hades invisible beneath his helm of darkness. The Titans would meet them in the plains or on the contested foothills between the two mountains. The clash when these divine forces met was cataclysmic. Zeus hurled his thunderbolts with increasing confidence and accuracy. Each bolt was a spear of concentrated electrical fury, and where it struck, the earth exploded, leaving craters that smoked and glowed with residual heat. Forests ignited instantly, becoming walls of flame that roared across the landscape. The sound of thunder rolled continuously across Thessaly, a drumbeat of divine warfare that never ceased. Day blending into night, blending into day with no respite from the noise. Poseidon struck the ground with his trident, and earthquakes rippled outward from the point of impact. The earth bucked and heaved like a living thing in pain. Cracks opened in the ground, chasms that swallowed trees and boulders. Mountains themselves trembled, and rock slides cascaded down their slopes. Hades, wearing his helm of darkness, brought a different kind of terror to the battlefield. Invisible, he could slip behind Titan lines and wreak havoc. He destroyed supplies and equipment, sabotaged defenses, and sowed confusion in enemy ranks. The Titans never knew when Hades might be present, and the paranoia this created was as damaging as any direct assault. But the Titans were far from helpless. Hyperion unleashed the burning power of light itself, creating heat so intense that it could melt stone. Waves of radiance swept across the battlefield, forcing the Olympians to shield their eyes or be blinded. The very air shimmered and rippled with thermal currents. Where Hyperion walked, the ground beneath his feet turned to glass, sand fused by the intensity of his presence. Iapetus brought his fierce combat skills to bear, engaging in direct combat with the Olympian forces. Where Zeus struck from afar with his bolts, Iapetus closed to melee range, wielding weapons forged in the early days of the world. He was a terror in close quarters, his divine strength able to shatter even enchanted armor, his endurance allowing him to fight for days without rest. Atlas, as the Titan commander, coordinated his forces with tactical brilliance. He identified choke points in the plains where the Olympians could be ambushed. He organized contingents of Titans to strike at Olympus itself, testing its defenses and seeking weak points. Under his leadership, the Titans mounted several major offensives that came dangerously close to overrunning the Olympian positions. The battle settled into a pattern of assault and counter-assault, siege and breakout, raid and counter-raid. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, months into years. The conflict ground on with either side able to gain a decisive advantage. It was in the middle years of the war that the Centaurs truly proved their worth. Until this point, they had fought alongside the other Olympian forces. But Zeus recognized that their true potential had not yet been fully utilized. In a strategic council, he proposed a bold plan that would leverage the Centaurs' unique abilities in a devastating way. Cronus, Briareus, and Gyges were sent on a special mission. They traveled to the broken lands around Mount Othrys, regions where the fighting had already shattered the landscape. 4 days, the three giants labored, using their 300 hands collectively to gather ammunition. They stockpiled mountains of rocks, some as large as houses, others merely the size of war chariots, creating enormous arsenals of natural projectiles. When the next major battle erupted, the Centaurs revealed what they had been preparing. From positions on the flanks of the Olympian forces, They began to hurl their stockpiled boulders. But this was not ordinary throwing. Each of the three brothers had 100 arms, and they used them all simultaneously. Cronus alone could launch 100 boulders in the time it took a god to throw one. 300 hands meant 300 projectiles, a constant bombardment that darkened the sky like an artificial storm of stone. The Titans, advancing across the plains toward Olympus, found themselves caught in this barrage. Boulders rained down upon them with devastating frequency. There was no way to dodge them all, no possibility of defending against such overwhelming volume. The Titan advance stalled, then broke. The Centaurs had turned the tide, and the Titans found themselves in full retreat, racing back toward Mount Othrys with boulders crashing around them. But the most dramatic and destructive assaults came from Zeus himself, who had been growing more confident and powerful as the war progressed. As he wielded his thunderbolts, he came to understand them better, to feel the storm power that flowed through them. In the 8th year of the war, Zeus decided to demonstrate the full extent of his power. He ascended to the highest peak of Mount Olympus, standing on the throne of Zeus. He raised his hands, and clouds began to gather. Not natural weather patterns but storm systems called into being by his will. Lightning flickered within those clouds, not occasional flashes but continuous, branching patterns of electricity that webbed across the underbelly of the storm. Then Zeus unleashed his thunderbolts. Not one or two but dozens, a concentrated bombardment directed at Mount Othrys and the Titan positions around it. Bolt after bolt lanced down from the roiling clouds, each one striking with devastating precision. Where they hit, explosions of light and sound erupted. Rock vaporized. The very peak of Mount Othrys, where Cronus had his throne, was struck by a dozen bolts in quick succession. The mountaintop, already weathered by years of warfare, began to crumble under the assault. Ancient texts speak of this bombardment with awe and terror. They describe how Zeus threw so many thunderbolts that the earth groaned beneath the onslaught. Forests burst into flame instantly, becoming infernos that raged across the mountainsides. The heat was so intense that sand melted into glass, and in some places, the rock itself began to flow like water. In the 9th year of the war, the Titans attempted one final major offensive. Atlas, knowing that his forces were flagging, that morale was crumbling, decided that only a bold stroke could change the momentum. He gathered every Titan and allied being who could still fight, and launched a desperate assault directly on Mount Olympus itself. The assault was fierce and coordinated. Atlas himself led the main thrust, climbing the slopes of Olympus with inexorable determination, swatting aside defenders, pushing through every obstacle. For a time, it seemed the gamble might pay off. The Titans made it further up the mountain than they had ever managed before. But they had underestimated how much the Olympians had learned, how strong they had become over 9 years of constant warfare. Zeus met Atlas in personal combat on a plateau halfway up the mountain. The two Titans clashed with earth-shaking force. Poseidon struck the mountainside with his trident, and the entire slope began to shake. Titans lost their footing, tumbling back down amid cascading boulders and debris. Hades, invisible, moved through the attacking forces, cutting down Titans from behind, sowing panic and confusion. The battle raged for what seemed like an eternity but was probably only days. Eventually, the Titan offensive broke. Atlas, wounded and exhausted, was forced to retreat. It was the beginning of the end. In the 10th year of the war, the final decisive battles took place. The Titans, depleted and demoralized after their failed offensive, found themselves on the defensive. The Olympians, sensing victory within reach, pressed their advantage relentlessly. The Centimanes unleashed another massive bombardment, this time advancing as they threw. Zeus called down lightning continuously, the sky never clear, thunder never silent. One by one, the Titans fell. Not killed but defeated, battered into submission by the inexorable advance. Cronus, seeing his forces disintegrating around him, fought with the desperation of a being who knew that his time had come. The prophecy he had tried so hard to prevent was fulfilling itself before his eyes. His son had risen against him, had gathered allies, had waged war, and was now on the verge of total victory. The final confrontation between Zeus and Cronus is not described in great detail in the surviving myths. But we can imagine the moment when father and son faced each other across a battlefield littered with the debris of a 10-year war. Zeus, young and powerful and righteous in his cause, confronting Cronus, old in the way that even immortals can age. Zeus prevailed. Whether through superior strength, better strategy, or simply the weight of destiny, he struck down his father. Cronus fell, defeated. And with his fall, the last organized Titan resistance collapsed. The war was over. The Olympians had won. The aftermath of the Titanomachy required organization and decision-making that would shape the cosmos for all time to come. Zeus, now the undisputed victor, had to decide what to do with the defeated Titans, how to prevent future rebellions, and how to establish a new order that would be stable and just. The defeated Titans were rounded up from across the battlefield and from their hiding places throughout Mount Othrys and the surrounding region. Cronus, Iapetus, Hyperion, Zeus, Crius, and the other male Titans who had fought against the Olympians were chained with bonds forged by the Cyclopes, unbreakable links that even divine strength could not sunder. Then came the question of where to imprison them. Zeus made a decision that had a certain poetic justice to it. The Titans would be cast into Tartarus, that deep abyss that had once held the Cyclopes and Centimanes, where Cronus himself had kept his monstrous siblings imprisoned. It was the same fate Cronus had inflicted on others now inflicted upon him. A bronze anvil dropped from the heights of heaven would take 9 days to fall to earth, and another 9 days to fall from earth to Tartarus. That's how deep the prison was, how far removed from the world above. The Titans were hurled down into that darkness. The Centimanes, the very beings who had been Cronus's prisoners and who had helped Zeus win the war, were appointed as guards. Codus, Briareus, and Gyges took up positions around Tartarus, their 300 hands and 150 heads ensuring that no prisoner could escape. Poseidon, using his divine power over earth and sea, created gates of bronze that sealed the pit, gates that no ray of light could penetrate, through which no breath of wind could pass. But not all the Titans were imprisoned. Zeus recognized that some had not fought against him, and others had actively aided his cause. The female Titans, the Titanesses, were generally spared. Many of them had not participated in the fighting, and Zeus saw no reason to punish them for their brother's choices. Themis, who had sided with Zeus from the beginning, retained her position and her honor. Rhea, Zeus's own mother, who had saved him and set the entire chain of events in motion, was treated with the respect due to the mother of the king of gods. Oceanus and Tethys, who had remained neutral throughout the conflict, were left to continue their dominion over the world's waters. Prometheus and Epimetheus, who had fought for Zeus, were also spared, though Prometheus's later theft of fire for humanity would eventually lead to his own punishment. Chained to a mountain with an eagle eating his regenerating liver for eternity. But that was a tale for the future. Atlas, however, received a special punishment that reflected his importance in the Titan forces. As the general who had led the armies against Zeus, he could not simply be imprisoned with the others. Zeus decreed that Atlas would bear a burden for all eternity. The sky itself, the great dome of the heavens that arched over the earth, was placed upon Atlas's shoulders. The giant Titan was forced to stand at the western edge of the world, holding up the heavens and preventing them from collapsing back down onto the earth. It was a punishment that was both physical and symbolic. Atlas had stood against the new order and now literally supported it. Every day for all eternity, he would feel the weight of the cosmos pressing down upon him. His tremendous strength turned to a purpose he had fought against. Menoetius, Atlas's brother who had fought with particular ferocity and arrogance, was struck by one of Zeus's thunderbolts and cast down into Erebus. Arc, the messenger goddess who had betrayed the Olympians to serve the Titans, had her iridescent wings torn off and was thrown into Tartarus, never to fly again. With the defeated dealt with, Zeus turned to the question of governance. He had fought for 10 years to overthrow Cronus, but he did not want to simply replicate the old order with himself in his father's place. The war had been fought not just for power but for a better way of ruling the cosmos, for justice rather than tyranny. Zeus called together his siblings, and together they decided to divide the cosmos into realms. But rather than Zeus claiming everything for himself as Cronus had done, they would cast lots to determine who would rule what. This was a remarkable decision, a willingness to submit to chance rather than simply claiming power by right of conquest. The lots were drawn, and the results would define the divine order for all time. Zeus drew the lot for the sky and the heavens. He would be lord of the bright ether, ruler of the storms. The god who reigned from the heights of Mount Olympus. With this realm came the recognition as king of the gods. Poseidon drew the lot for the seas and all the waters of the earth. Every ocean, every river, every spring and lake would fall under his domain. He would make his palace in the depths of the Aegean, wielding his trident as the symbol of his authority over the watery realm. Hades drew the lot for the underworld, the realm of the dead. It was not considered a lesser realm but simply a different one, as necessary to the cosmic order as sky or sea. Hades would rule over the shades of the deceased, overseeing the judgment of souls and the distribution of punishment or reward in the afterlife. The earth itself was declared common ground, accessible to all three brothers and to the other gods as well. The other gods and goddesses were given their own portfolios based on their natures and the roles they had played during the war. Hestia became goddess of the hearth and home. Demeter received dominion over the harvest and agriculture. Hera, as Zeus's wife and queen, would preside over marriage and family. Styx and her children received the rewards Zeus had promised. Nike stood beside Zeus as the personification of victory. The cosmos was restructured, reorganized according to principles of justice and order rather than fear and arbitrary power. Mount Olympus became not just a fortress but a divine city, with palaces constructed for each of the major gods. These were magnificent buildings crafted by Hephaestus, son of Hera, a divine smith whose skill rivaled even that of the Cyclopes. Walls of marble and gold rose on the heights of Olympus, buildings that would stand for eternity. Zeus established a council system where the major gods could meet and discuss matters affecting the cosmos. Laws were established, codes of conduct that even gods were expected to follow. The concept of xenia, sacred hospitality, became enshrined as a divine principle. Oaths sworn on the river Styx became binding, creating a system of trust and accountability. The Fates, daughters of Themis, were given authority over destiny itself. weaving the threads of fate for gods and mortals alike. And even Zeus himself acknowledged their power and accepted that some things were beyond even his control. The Titanomachy was more than just a war. It represented a fundamental shift in the cosmic order, the transition from the primordial chaos of the early world to the organized structure that would characterize the classical Greek understanding of the universe. The Titans, for all their power, represented the old ways, the arbitrary rule of strength and fear. The Olympians, despite their own flaws and complexities, represented a more ordered cosmos where justice, however imperfect, had a place. The war also established patterns that would repeat throughout Greek mythology. The theme of sons overthrowing fathers, which began with Cronus castrating Uranus and continued with Zeus overthrowing Cronus, would echo through countless other myths. The cycle of violence and succession, prophecy and attempted circumvention, created a narrative framework that the Greeks used to explore questions of fate, free will, and the nature of power. But the victory of the Olympians did not mean that all threats to their rule were eliminated. The cosmos continued to be a dynamic place, full of conflicts and challenges. The Gigantomachy, the war against the giants, would test the Olympians again. Typhon, the monstrous offspring of Gaia and Tartarus, would mount the most severe challenge to Zeus's individual power. These subsequent conflicts, however, proved that the Olympian system was more resilient than what had come before. Where Cronus had ruled through fear and Uranus through sheer power, the Olympians had built a structure that could withstand challenges. The system was not perfect, but it was stable in a way that the rule of the Titans had never been. The Titanomachy also influenced how the ancient Greeks understood their world. The scars of divine warfare could be seen in the landscape of Thessaly, in the broken peaks and deep ravines, in the altered courses of rivers and the fields of boulders scattered across the plains. When they looked at these geological features, they saw evidence of the Great War, proof that the myths they told were rooted in the very stone of the earth itself. Mount Olympus, snow-capped and majestic, became a symbol of divine order and justice. Pilgrims would climb its slopes, seeking to get closer to the realm of the gods, even though they knew they could never reach the true Olympus, the divine palace that existed in the ether above the physical mountain. The mountain served as a connection point between the mortal and divine realms, a reminder that the gods, while removed and powerful, were still connected to the world of humans. The myths of the Titanomachy also provided the Greeks with a way to think about change and revolution. The overthrow of the old gods by the new paralleled human political changes, the replacement of tyrannies with more representative forms of government. Zeus, despite being a king, was a king who acknowledged limits to his power and who worked within a system of divine law. The tale had moral dimensions too. Cronus's fate illustrated the dangers of paranoia and fear. His attempt to prevent the prophecy through devouring his children was not only cruel but ultimately futile. Fate could not be cheated, and his very attempts to prevent his overthrow created the conditions that made it inevitable. Had he raised his children with love and justice, perhaps they would have had no reason to rebel. His imprisonment in Tartarus was as much a consequence of his own actions as it was a punishment imposed by Zeus. Conversely, Zeus's willingness to free the unjustly imprisoned Cyclopes and Centimanes, to honor his oaths to Styx, to share power with his siblings rather than claiming everything for himself, these actions were presented as virtuous and wise. The Titanomachy became a story about how justice, courage, and strategic thinking could overcome even overwhelming odds. As the centuries passed and Greek civilization evolved, the story of the Titanomachy remained central to their mythology and culture. Artists depicted scenes from the war on pottery and in sculpture, poets from Hesiod onward retold the tale, each adding their own details and emphases, ensuring that the story remained vital and relevant to each new generation. And in the end, perhaps what makes the Titanomachy so enduringly fascinating is that it combines cosmic spectacle with deeply human themes. It is about power and politics, yes, but also about family and betrayal, about fear and courage, about the old giving way to the new. It is a story that operates on multiple levels simultaneously, entertaining as an action-filled epic of divine warfare while also providing deeper insights into the nature of authority, the importance of justice, and the consequences of both tyranny and rebellion. The 10-year war that shook the cosmos came to define an age. It established the Olympian gods as the supreme powers of the Greek universe, and set the stage for all the myths that would follow. Every story of Zeus and his thunderbolts, every tale of Poseidon's wrath or Hades's judgment, every myth featuring the Olympian gods rested on the foundation of the Titanomachy. Without that great war, without Zeus's victory over Cronus, the entire structure of Greek mythology would have been different. As you drift toward sleep now, perhaps you can imagine those ancient battlefields, the mountains shaking with divine fury, the sky split by lightning, the earth trembling beneath the feet of giants. Picture the triumph of the new gods, the establishment of order from chaos, the beginning of the age that would give birth to so many of the stories that have echoed down through the millennia to reach us today. The Titanomachy is over, the gods have taken their thrones, and the cosmos settles into its new order. The story ends, but its echoes continue forever. If you enjoyed this journey through the Titanomachy, this exploration of Zeus's overthrow of Cronus and the Titans, please consider liking this video and subscribing to History Sleep Stories. We bring you the great tales of mythology and history, told in a style designed to be both educational and soothing, perfect for learning or for drifting off to peaceful sleep. Hit that notification bell to be alerted when we release new episodes. And leave a comment telling us what other mythological events you'd like us to explore. From all of us here at History Sleep Stories, sleep well, dream deeply, and may your rest be as peaceful as the cosmos after the Titanomachy. Good night.